Hello there. What I'm going to talk about today is all about self-acceptance. So last week I was talking about when we make mistakes and how we can see ourselves as one-dimensional. We can look at our mistake and we can look at what we've done, and we can make that a story about ourselves and how bad we are. And one of the things I suggested we do is that we actually listen to what people are telling us about ourselves. And when people pay us compliments, to actually really hear those compliments, to receive them, so that we recognise it's not just somebody trying to be nice to us, but someone actually telling us a truth about ourselves, and to listen to that and to recognise that we are so much more than our mistakes. So that's one way in which we can help to move our self-acceptance along. I think it's really important to recognise that self-acceptance isn't a state that we suddenly reach and then maintain. Self-acceptance is actually an ongoing journey. We need to continue to work at accepting ourselves, because there's always things that are going to be coming up. We keep on discovering more and more about ourselves, and so the self-acceptance journey is just that. It's a journey, it's not a destination. We don't suddenly arrive there. We're continually working at it, and it's important not to think, oh well, I don't accept myself because I don't accept one aspect of myself. And it's talking about the things that we find difficult to accept ourselves. That's the area that I want to cover today. Because if someone does give us a bit of positive feedback and they say, oh, you know, people quite often say to me, oh, you come across as very calm, you're very confident. I sort of can hear those because they're quite acceptable aspects of myself, and I'm quite happy to hear those sorts of comments. But when someone says, oh, well, I'm surprised to hear you sounding so judgmental, that's quite a different thing to accept about myself, because I don't want to be judgmental towards other people. But sometimes I have to accept that, yes, I am judgmental, and sometimes I am critical. And how do we move towards accepting those less acceptable parts of ourselves, the things that perhaps we don't want to be, the things that we can beat ourselves up about and wish that we weren't like that, the things that we want to hide, that we don't want others to see, and, you know, cover up and pretend then that they aren't there. And in a sense, if we're doing that, we're not acting with integrity, we're not being true to ourselves, we're not being authentic. And we do that to make ourselves acceptable to other people. And by doing that, what we're doing is we're putting ourselves at the mercy of other people. And what would be helpful for us to do would be to actually accept all of ourselves. It's useful at this point to think we often divide the way we think about people. It's quite useful to think that we might have what we call multiple selves, or different parts of ourselves. And this helps us because we can recognise that there's a part of ourselves that we find quite acceptable. So that would be, you know, being calm or wise, something like that. And that's an acceptable part. I'm happy to claim that. But there might be another part of myself that's sort of quite critical and judgmental, and I find that much more difficult to accept. So how do we move towards accepting the whole of ourselves and not just the parts that we like? And I've talked about sort of self-critical, judgmental parts of myself, other parts that people might not like about themselves. I've got clients who really don't like their anxiety. I've got clients who really don't like the fact that they can't stop eating. It's things like that we really don't like about ourselves. We don't like ourselves to be lazy, for example. We don't like ourselves to be a fat slob. We don't like ourselves to be depressed. Those are all aspects of ourselves that we find it really difficult to accept about ourselves, and we want to move away from that. And I'm not saying that There shouldn't be an effort to try and be calmer if we feel anxious, or to try and eat more healthily if we're eating unhealthily. It's not that, but there's almost like a block. We can't really start working on those areas until we accept that stuff about ourselves. But how do we do it? That's this sort of $60 million question. How do we actually accept the parts of ourselves that we don't like? And actually, it's those parts of ourselves that need our most attention. We want to sort of hide them away in a cupboard. We don't want them to come out into the light because we feel so ashamed of them. And it really helps. One of the things that I do as part of my meditation practice is there's something called the metta meditation. And this is where we wish peace and happiness to ourselves or to other people. And we say, may you find peace, may you find happiness. And we can hold in our mind a dear friend, a loved one. It can be more challenging. We can hold in our minds someone that we don't like. And often the most challenging thing to hold in our minds is ourselves. And actually people really struggle to wish themselves metta, to wish themselves that they may find peace, that they may find happiness, because they feel they don't deserve it. And one of the things we do when we have that sort of block is to notice that there's resistance to accepting the peace, there's resistance to accepting the happiness, there's a resistance to actually wishing ourselves that sense of peace and happiness because we don't feel we deserve it. And when you've come across that resistance, you can actually wish the resistance to find peace, the resistance to find happiness. And if you can be really compassionate towards that part of you that's resisting, it can really melt some of the resistance. So for me, the judgmental part of myself, I can wish that peace and I can wish that happiness, because actually the judgmental part of myself is the part that's hurting the most. And that judgmental part of myself comes from the part that's known bullying and criticism and has learnt to judge and has learnt to live in that way. And if I can wish that part of myself peace and happiness, what I'm doing is I'm actually embracing the hurting part of myself. And I think the same is true of all these different things that we don't like about ourselves. The reason they're there is because at some point we've been damaged by something. And if we can hold that in mind, if we can hold that resistance in a way gently and softly, compassionately, imagine the kindest person that you know and what they would say to that part of you that's resisting. They'd be very kind to it. And if we can do that to ourselves, it begins to just break down the resistance. It begins to help us to be a little bit kinder to ourselves. And as we're kinder to ourselves, we can accept those things about us, and we can stop being quite so angry with ourselves. And then the other thing that happens, especially if it's something to do with criticism or judgment, is we can see, we can understand what other people are as well and where they're coming from. And that helps us to be more accepting of other people as well. So thanks very much for watching the live feed. I hope that helps. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please do contact me via the message button on Facebook, or you can visit me at talktojo.co.uk. You can see my website there. Or if you're a parent looking for help, you can look at thegoodenoughmum.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Bye.